Christianity had a different impact in China. Chinese Christians often faced a lot of persecution and isolation. Foreigners were not particularly welcome in China, and so being connected with a foreign religion often led to you being isolated as well if you were a Chinese. But there were Christians in China, missionaries who would make their way into China every so often. But often with the spread of Christianity would come the countries trying to expand their imperial power. And by the middle of the 19th century, many Western imperialism had gained footing in China and garnered a variety of concessions for trade, which often led to unintended consequences. In 1847, the son of a farmer from southern China, Huang Quan, failed the imperial exams for the third time. And in his, the aftermath of this letdown, he kind of fell into this delirium. Right? He kind of had, we might say, a mental break. After he recovered, he became convinced that he should lead a rebellion to overthrow the government and establish Taiping Tianguo, the heavenly kingdom of great harmony or great peace, with himself as the emperor of great peace. He would preach a variety of things. He preached the necessity of communal belongings, everybody having a common possession, equality between men and women, as well as law. He would preach 4 laws against prostitution, adultery, slavery, against opium, the binding of girls' feet. People would bind them to make them smaller, keep them from growing. Preach against tobacco and alcohol. A lot of these beliefs reflected traditional Confucianism and other Chinese systems, but others of his beliefs came specifically from Christianity. And so instead of the polytheistic or animistic views of many traditional Chinese systems, he preached the importance of monotheism, the importance of the 10 Commandments and observing the Sabbath. He condemned Chinese idol worship, which is what he would talk about, the ancestor worship. And he would also claim to be the younger brother of Jesus. This is just an example of this from one of the writings from the Heavenly Kingdom called The Land System of the Heavenly Kingdom. Quote, throughout the empire, all officials must every Sabbath, according to rank and position, reverently present sacrificial animals and offerings, sacrifice and worship, and praise the Heavenly Father, the Supreme Lord and great God. And they must also expound the holy books. Should any dare to neglect this duty, they shall be reduced to husbandmen, tilling the ground. Respect this. His early followers came from the poor, the outcast, but gradually he built up an army, led a rebellion that lasted for 15 years. It's estimated that around 20 to 30 million people died in the rebellion. Hong died in 1864 of food poisoning in a city that was under siege, and the rebellion leadership fell shortly after that. Questions about any of the political developments so far? Let's turn then to the United States and think about what's going on in the United States. Go, Trent.
What do we need to know about William Wilberforce?
Wilberforce, you don't really need to know him. I just mentioned him as he's a prime British abolitionist, but don't have time to get too much into him. So. In the 19th century, there's so much we could say about Christianity and politics in the United States. But since we've been tracing this development of slavery, I want to focus on slavery and, of course, the Civil War. By the 19th century, as we as you think back to some of the things that we talked about, slave conditions have begun to change in the United States. The international slave trade officially ended in 1808. Still kind of went on, illegally, but officially it ended in 1808, and that was within the Constitution. But by this time, the international slave trade was not that important to those that enslaved Africans. Planters and slave traders in the 17th and 18th century had largely focused on enslaving African men. Their focus was, I need a workforce, I need people out in the fields doing heavy lifting, we're going to enslave men. But eventually people began to decide that if they enslaved women as well and forcefully brought them over here, they could perpetuate their workforce through procreation instead of having to continually go back to Africa. And so by the 19th century, we have a group of people that we can refer to as African Americans, that they are born in the United States. Prior to this point, because of the population dynamics, demographics, it was African slavery. But with this, of course, is now African American Christianity that is developing. By the 19th century as well, slavery had been eliminated in the North. Again, remember, there were people pushing for the ending of slavery, but most of slavery ended in the North because it didn't make economic sense, not because of a moral concern of slavery. And it didn't make sense to have an enslaved populace because there wasn't the need for that kind of force. Now, eventually, some Northerners do become concerned about the treatment of slaves. And some Christians would push forward the idea that holding slaves was unchristian. With the development of Christianity among the African American populace, you do begin to see in the 19th century some African American denominations. We talked, for example, about the AME, or the African Methodist Episcopal Church, started by Richard Allen. I almost lost the name for a minute. And other groups like that. But within African and African American Christianity, you also saw not just that influence, but the influence of other religious systems as well. As I mentioned, probably anywhere from 15 to 20% of slaves from Africa were Muslims. So about 1 in 5. And there are records of people trying to maintain some of the practices of Islam throughout the period of slavery, passing that on to their children as well. But you also have the development of what we might refer to as hybrid movements, particularly of West African religious systems melding with Christianity, particularly Catholicism in places like Louisiana and other places in the South. So religions like Santeria, Candomblé, which have Yoruban, West African roots, but they also have some Catholic connections as well. And so those developments are going on. But additionally, in thinking about Christianity and politics, you're also beginning to see Southern Christians appealing to certain arguments to justify slavery. There are a couple that become quite prominent and quite well worn by Southerners in promoting the idea that Christianity is acceptable, slavery is acceptable within Christianity. One of the first arguments was the presence of slavery in the Bible. Abraham had slaves. Other prominent, faithful individuals had servants, had slaves. And so, by the fact that here are these righteous people in the Bible who had slaves, slavery is acceptable. Kind of connected with that, Southerners would point to the lack of commendation, or condemnation, not commendation, condemnation. In fact, slavery was regulated. And so they would appeal to places like the book of Philemon and the relationship between Paul and Onesimus, and talk about how Paul had sent Onesimus back to Philemon instead of telling him, set him free. They would also appeal to Paul's statements about slaves obey your masters. They would also argue their guidelines regulating slavery in the Old Testament. Now, if you were particularly astute at this point on your overview of Old Testament slave regulations, you might say, aha, there's a regulation that at the 7-year mark, you had the 3-year slaves. Well, in the southern mind, since blacks weren't whites, they weren't the Israelites, they thought they didn't have to offer them their freedom at the 7-year mark. Right? And so already you've got to begin to say, okay, maybe this is not, as much as they're trying to say we're following the Bible, they're not following the Bible. The third area that was quite popular as far as examples of, or ways to promote or argue in favor of slavery was the curse of Ham and the curse of Canaan, which comes from the flood, Noah and the flood. So if you remember back, the story we get in Sunday school is of Noah and the animals 2 by 2 on the ark, and then the dove and the raven and the rainbow. Well, if you keep reading in Genesis after that, Noah plants a vineyard and gets drunk. And it was interesting in the Noah movie that just came out, I guess it was last year, a lot of people got upset about this part, saying, Noah's righteous, how can you do that? And even though there were a lot of things in that movie that weren't from the Bible, that one was. Right? So Noah gets drunk, passes out naked in his tent. Ham, his son Ham, goes in, sees his brother naked, goes back out, and apparently makes fun of this to Shem and Japheth. They, respecting their father, will cover him up, but will walk backwards with a blanket between them so they don't see their father's nakedness. When Noah comes to and finds out what Ham has done, he curses Ham, and also curses his son Canaan, and says that Canaan's descendants are going to be the servant of servants. Well, when you go into the next chapter, there's a list of the genealogies of who descended from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and included in Canaan's genealogy are people that started the countries in Africa. And so the curse of Ham, the curse of Canaan, becomes a way for people to say, look, this is biblically the Africans were condemned to be the lowest of the low. Again, probably not the right interpretation of Scripture. It doesn't make sense, but for 19th century individuals trying to support slavery biblically, this was prominent for a lot of people. Out of that, a lot of people were also concerned about the impact Christianity could have on their slaves. Right? So you have some people wanting to promote Christianity. Christians themselves, want to say that if we convert the slaves, they will be better slaves. Right? So slaves obey your masters, all of these kind of things. But on other hands, there are a lot of concerns. The Baptists and the Methodists especially had been very effective in evangelizing slaves. And so many slaveholders were very concerned about this. They were concerned especially about slave preachers. So there were a variety of attempts to try and regulate the preaching of black preachers. Strict laws were put in place that limited preaching by African Americans. Additionally, masters would often restrict and hold slave preachers to specific texts that would place the masters, especially, in a positive light. And so you would have sermons extolling proper relationships toward masters, the wanting to Christianize the slaves while maintaining the master's power base. Often, masters would hire white preachers to come preach instead of allowing slaves to become preachers. There was also the concern that slaves were, and they were, gathering outside of white notice in the night, in secret. And so preaching out of the white slave-holding control was an unthinkable risk. Masters and others in the South worried not only about black preachers preaching rebellion, but they were also concerned about any preachers who preached equality of both white and black. And so it wasn't just about preventing slaves from, revolting. It was also about creating a frame of reference that allowed Southern whites to perceive African Americans as only partly human. And that they're Christian, but they can still be looked upon as slaves. And so gatherings at night and in other places were prohibited. There were also concerns over the fact that slaves might learn to read, and through reading come across certain passages in the Bible that would talk about equality and freedom. And so it was prohibited in many of the southern states, again, of many laws prohibiting teaching slaves to read. Much more we could say about how Christianity was often intertwined with slave revolts. The very thing that masters feared often did happen. But again, we don't have the time to go through that, and so we skipped a lot of important history to bring us to the Civil War. Certainly the Civil War didn't have the same kind of Christian involvement as you see in the Taiping Rebellion, where he's using Christianity to justify his rebellion. And so the Civil War was a political event just like the Revolution was. But Christianity was involved heavily in a lot of this as well. When people would talk about the need to secede from the Union, often the arguments that were used were the same arguments that had ended up splitting the denominations on sectional lines. The Methodists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians in the 1830s and 1840s divided into North and South versions. And as those divided, those arguments were then later used by politicians to say, this is why we need to leave the Union. Right? And so it had been a denominational argument, but became a political argument. Ministers were often called upon to support secession and would preach in southern pulpits about the necessity of dissolving the Union. In the North, Christianity was often connected with the developing moral outrage over slavery and law supporting. For example, William Seward, who was a senator from New York and later Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, said that he would not follow the fugitive slave law of 1851 that required Northerners to take fugitive slaves back to their masters. He said, I cannot support that because I need to obey a higher law. And so Christianity is serving as the foundation for condemning slavery. Both sides of the war justified their actions by appealing to God. They prayed for God's blessing. They saw the war as a sacred cause, and they saw the war in the context of the beginning of God's kingdom on earth. This millennium, that out of this turmoil was going to come this great period of peace and prosperity. A good example of this is reflected in the song Battle Hymn of the Republic. When you think about some of the things that are said in there about, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He has loosed the fearful lightning of his terrible sword. He's trampled out the benches where his grapes of wrath are stored. Our God is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea with the glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make us holy, let us die to make men free while God is marching on. And so this idea of God's army moving through to establish this new period in time. You can't help but see the millennialism in Lincoln's second inaugural address as he hopes that out of the turmoil peace will come. But that too demonstrates this kind of influence of Christianity. This concern of changing society that we see in abolitionism was a part of a larger movement in the 19th century to transform society for the better in a variety of ways.